Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. President Zelensky is navigating an extremely difficult period as Ukraine faces multiple crises, deteriorating battlefield conditions, a growing fiscal gap, internal political strife, and a corruption investigation that has sparked significant controversy as Russia increases its pressure on Ukraine, including a recent strike on a Turkish LNG tanker near Odessa. The Americans, under President Trump, may be signaling a tougher stance, preparing so-called very severe sanctions against any nation doing business with Moscow. At the same time, Zelensky's European tour contrasts with mounting political difficulties at home, where Ukraine's largest wartime corruption scandal is raising concerns about public trust and Western support. To help us understand the evolving situation, we're now joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, University College Dublin. As always, pleasure to have you here on TVP World.
Thank you so much.
So let's start with the good. President Zelensky is on a European tour. He's been to Greece, now in France. He secured some of these wins, energy deals with the LNG thing going through the Balkans, through Greece, the 100 Rafales potentially being purchased by France. I mean, how does this change the operational realities, however, on the ground for Ukraine?
Well, it's part of the recognition and the preparation for the fact that this continues to be a Russian invasion with no foreseeable end. So if you're going to face Vladimir Putin's, ongoing attempt to conquer Ukraine, you've got to provide military support for Kyiv. And that's what we've seen yesterday in France with that commitment over 10 years, not only to the Rafale fighter jets, but to air defense and radar systems and to other key military equipment. You have to provide Ukraine with energy support as Russia tries to break Ukraine with those missile and drone strikes on infrastructure and civilian areas. And that's the significance of the announcement of Greece providing the U.S. supplied liquefied natural gas on a route which will go into Odessa in southern Ukraine. And then beyond this trip, we have this open issue, which you talked about in your summary, which is that of the ongoing financial support. Ukraine, because it is under this relentless assault, cannot balance its budget. In fact, there is that serious need to cover a shortfall, which is estimated at around 130 billion euros in 2026, 2027. And that's where we don't have definitive progress yet. The headlines have been that it could come from this reparations loan that would be backed by the frozen Russian assets. But as you noted, Belgium, which holds most of those assets, is still holding out against that. So if you don't use that reparations loan, how do you borrow the money? How do EU states borrow the money and then provide it to Kyiv? And that's what the European Commission highlighted in its letter to members yesterday.
Yeah. I think with the whole frozen Russian assets in Belgium, this is still something we've been talking about for a while. There seems to be some kind of guarantee on its way for Belgium, but we're not 100% clear yet when that will be. But at the same time, looking at his tour right now, always looking at the military commitments, yes. On paper, 100 fighter jets, that's a great thing. But as you said, that'll take some time. The energy, that will take also time to deploy. Are we now here plugging gaps? Is it ever really sufficient? Is it sufficient for the moment, what Ukraine needs, in your mind?
Well, this is a multi-level conflict. And so when we highlight the fighter jets, we're highlighting a longer term aspect here. And remember that, Sweden has committed up to 150 Gripen fighter jets over the next 10 years, including joint production with Ukraine. And that's the prospect that, if Russia is going to continue to carry out this assault to Ukraine, how do you both protect Ukraine's skies, but also how do you counterattack inside Russia? What I think you're probably pointing to is, well, what about on the ground? What about on the front lines? And as you mentioned, we have had gradual Russian advances, not only in the Donetsk region in the east, but in the past week, they've taken several villages in the partly occupied Zaporizhzhia region in the south. And I have to say that's concerning. It's been highlighted by President Zelensky and Ukraine's military that is concerning, that the Russians make those gradual advances. But at the same time, you have to note this is not a breakthrough. This is not Russia sweeping through Ukraine and effectively defeating Ukraine. What it means is Russia trying to get increased leverage if we do go to the negotiating table by having just a bit more of Donetsk and by having just a bit more of Zaporizhia.
Mm-hmm. Let's also draw out the wider battlefield here. I mean, this is something, actually, the Turkish foreign minister said that at the moment the war is now a costly stalemate. And I mentioned Turkey for a reason, because we have reports that apparently a Turkish tanker, LNG tanker, was struck. So, I mean, if we look at that, also, I mean, this is a hot zone in the Black Sea. But the relation between Turkey and Russia, I mean, if we go back, was it 2015 with that downing of that drone? Now with this LNG tanker, how does this change Turkey's role in this? This certainly looks a bit complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's note this is not a coincidence that this attack, which set afire the Turkish tanker, comes only a day after the announcement of that provision of LNG on that route from Greece to Odessa. And so the Russians are signaling, look, this is not a safe port. You want to supply the LNG, we'll hit you. Now, the risk that they take with that, which you've highlighted, is that they damage their relations with other states. So far, Turkey has played the broker, or tried to play the broker in this Russian invasion. Go all the way back to 2022 with the talks in Istanbul. And Turkey publicly is still looking to play the broker. But if Vladimir Putin's not going to come to the negotiating table, and if on top of that, he's hitting Turkish interest and he's hitting the interest of other countries, there may be a reassessment of position. The wider framework for this, and I'll just lay this out here, is that the reason why we're talking about this Russian escalation and why Putin's taking risk is that because of the Russian economic situation, because you cannot have an open-ended invasion in terms of resources and the strain on the Russian economy, you're probably talking about a 6 to 12 month window for Russia to try to wrap this up. And, to try to wrap this up, they will take increased risk.
Mm-hmm. But also, as you said, increased risk that will damage its, let's say, not call them allies, but certainly with countries that they have some sort of affinity with. And I think Turkey will not take lightly with this whole thing. I'm just also curious as well, if we're looking at being tougher on Russia. I mean, we've heard now new sanctions by the United States looking at those two major oil companies and gas companies from Russia. That was announced not that long ago. Now, apparently, Donald Trump is saying there will be even more very severe sanctions on any country trading with Russia, so that potentially could include Iran. Now, what we hear from Donald Trump has to be taken, I think, with a large block of salt, I think, as we've discussed before. But at the same time, what do we make of his statement there? Because just a few days ago, Marco Rubio said, what's left to sanction? So how do we square these two rather different statements on sanctions?
Well, let's step back from Donald Trump for a minute, and let's go back to Turkey and indeed to India and to China, Russia's three largest oil customers. Because of the U.S. sanctions that were passed already and that take effect this month, and those include sanctions not only on those Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, it sanctions anybody who deals with them. The Turks have already reduced sharply their intake of Russian oil and are looking for alternative supplies, which I think the Americans will help arrange with the Gulf states. India has suspended, or five of India's 7 largest refiners have suspended all purchases of Russian oil in December. China has reduced its intake of Russian oil this month by 36%. So the existing U.S. sanctions that are coming into effect already are having an impact. Now, get beyond Donald Trump's statement. What we're talking about is, again, you mentioned in your summary, this bill that has been on the table for months in the U.S. Congress, which are sanctions of up to 500% on anyone who deals with the Russians. Now, that legislation was pushed aside while Donald Trump was still playing around with the possibility of a friendship with Vladimir Putin, notably through the summit in Alaska in August. Now that it appears that Trump realizes Putin's not willing to negotiate, those congressional sanctions are back on the table. And they go beyond what Marco Rubio said, and I think was a comment of frustration. What else can we sanction? You simply increase the secondary sanctions on Russia's trading partners, and it increases their risk to continue to fund Russia's invasion through trade, including the purchases of oil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting you mentioned that bill. I think this is also what we've heard recently just from Lindsey Graham, also saying that there'll be now renewed efforts to push this bill forward. I mean, looking at, okay, what's happened recently with the shutdown, et cetera, how realistic, how fast could this, if there's a political will now, as you kind of alluded to, how quickly could this come into effect?
I think we're still probably a ways away from this coming into effect, because we not only have got the question of whether or not the United States can recover from the previous government shutdown or whether it shuts down again at the end of January, but also the headline issue, which will dominate Congress over the next few days, is going to be the bill for the release of the files of the late pedophile, Jeffrey Epstein, right, including over his relationship with Trump. So I think this was more like Lindsey Graham waving his finger at the Russians saying, we'll come and get you, we'll come and get you. I think the focus here has to be on the effect of the existing sanctions that have already taken place, because they have already made a serious dent in Russia's oil revenue in the same week that the Russian central bank has confirmed that GDP growth is almost zero.
Yeah. And also looking at this, Zelensky is currently on a tour of European allies. As you said, we already mentioned some of those wins he's taking home. At the same time, we've alluded to this a little bit, that massive corruption scandal, that's not doing him any favors. How much would you say that allies see him more of, let's say at this point, has he crossed the threshold of become more of a liability? Is he still that leader of resilience? Where do you stand with that?
I wouldn't start with allies. I'd start with the Ukrainian people. I mean, look, I've got a lot of friends in Ukraine who have sacrificed a lot. And this is a betrayal. I mean, the idea that Zelensky's ex-business partner, Timur Mendic, the idea that the former deputy prime minister, that the justice minister, who was a former energy minister, that they were all tied up in this scandal for kickbacks of up to $100 million or 100 million euros, involving funds that were taken away from Ukraine's nuclear energy sector at a time when the Russians are bombing it. What would you feel like if you had lost a family member in the Russian invasion, if you had lost friends, if you've lost your home, if you've had to flee? What would you feel like in terms of what your government has done? So I think Zelensky, first of all, has got to show an answer to the Ukrainian people by dealing with this corruption scandal and making sure it doesn't happen again. And of course, it does have that effect that if Ukraine not only wants to get assistance to resist the Russian invasion, but beyond that, to get the path into the European Union, you have to show that those anti-corruption efforts, which I must emphasize are proceeding, at least you have anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine that survived the pressure to shut them down this summer. You have to show that you stick by that anti-corruption effort, because this is not something where you can just put all the burden on Ukraine's people and then let a few of the elite skate away, take tens, hundreds of millions of dollars or of euros, and then flee the country.
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, just in one brief sentence, Scott, I mean, looking at this very intense week with Ukraine, more optimistic, cautious, how do you wrap it up?
Ukraine still stands. Look, that's the fundamental. Ukraine still stands. Poland still stands, despite the fact you've had a serious act of sabotage on your soil, on that railway line. Europe still stands, despite Vladimir Putin's efforts to break it down and divide it, using Ukraine as basically the country to be devastated, to be annihilated. And as long as Ukraine stands, this idea that Putin has won and that everything is lost, I'm not going to buy that.
All right, so it does say still standing and optimism there. Look, always a pleasure speaking with you, Scott Lucas there. Thanks for your insight as always. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but there's much more coming up right here on TVP World, so don't go away.